It's my pleasure to introduce our today's keynote speaker, Mr. Reinhold Martin. We are very glad to have you here. Reinhold Martin is Professor of Architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia University, where he directs the PhD program in Architecture and the Temple Hohenbuhl Center for the Study of American Architecture. He's also a member of Columbia's Institute of Comparative Literature and Society, an institute that brings comparative methods of studying into the current globalized condition of producing knowledge. He's also a member of the Committee on Global Thought, a Columbia University interdisciplinary initiative that explores and interprets globalization. Mr. Martin is a founding co-editor of the journal Grey Room, an MIT journal that brings together scholarly and theoretical articles from the field of architecture, art, media, and politics to fork a cross-disciplinary discourse uniquely relevant to contemporary concerns. Reinhold Martin has published widely on the history and theory of modern and contemporary architecture. He is the author of the following books: The Organizational Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, a historical and theoretical analysis of the aesthetics and technological extension of the military-industrial complex in the United States after the Second World War. Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism Again, where he re-theorized postmodern architecture to give us new insights into cultural postmodernism and its aftermath. Reinhold Martin maintains a research practice with his partner Kadambari Basi, and they are co-authors of two books, Entropia and Multinational City, Architectural Itineraries, published by Akhtar, an analysis of three contemporary urban spaces, Silicon Valley, Manhattan, and Gurgaon close to New Delhi. In 2012, Martin created with Barry Bergdahl an exhibition called Foreclosure, Rehousing the American Dream. Foreclose significa hipoteca, para los que no lo sepan. At the MoMA in New York. This exhibition was an exploration of new architectural possibilities for cities and suburbs in the aftermath of the recent foreclosure crisis. None of these books can be found in our library, probably due to our budget cuts. But thanks to the internet, we can find easily in the web some of his interesting essays, of which I'm going to name only this. The Housing Question, about the necessity of public housing, and a critique of the American sprawl, both of them revolutionary ideas in USA. Occupy, the Day After, about the Occupy Wall Street phenomenon and the use of public space. Real estate as infrastructure as architecture, about the modernity power to transform substance into money. And directly related to our Congress theme, Moment of Truth and Critical of What towards a Utopian Realism. This one a difficult, very difficult concept, but to try to encircle it, at the end of this article, he says that a Utopian realist could be one who voted for Kerry. Probably, if Reinhold were living in Spain, he would have said someone that would have voted for Podemos. Reinhold, welcome to the Public School of Architecture of Madrid and to the Critical Congress, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks. It's funny to hear all of these things represented in such an insightful way. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, to all the, I know, multiple organizers of this very interesting conference. I apologize for not having been able to listen to anything other than the most recent roundtable and for missing my friend Joan Ockman's talk also, but maybe we can pick up some conversations one way or the other as we go. It really is a pleasure to be here in Madrid. I've been traveling for a couple of weeks, the last couple of weeks, and so I actually put together these slides before leaving, and so I just have a couple of provisos. One, if I speak too fast, please just wave or do something to tell me to slow down. I'll try to go a little more slowly, but I do, I'm aware of that. And, your English is far better than my Spanish, so it's out of respect for you that I want to say that. And then the other is, when I put these slides together, I did want to point out, but now I have to say, after last night, maybe a little, anachronistic. I wanted to let you know that just a few weeks ago, for some of us in New York, Madrid was a sort of ground zero at the center of at least one universe. But poor old Iker has had some further difficulties. I don't know what to say. I apologize on behalf of the world. But anyway, Madrid was really cool back in New York, and still is, regardless of the way that the Champions League final worked out. So anyway, back to the subject of the conference, and it's a very interesting one, and I really did enjoy listening to the discussion just now. In response, in trying to kind of make sense of how I could try to contribute and maybe help out, I have really a two-part lecture. So since this conference is dedicated to the problem of utopia and pragmatism officially, or more or less, and since the morning's panels, which again I'm sorry to have missed, revisited what we call the post-critical debates, but also considered the urban condition in one way or the other, I thought I would begin in this first part of the lecture by putting those two things together. And so this is the realism part of the lecture. We could perhaps call it pragmatism. We can discuss, if you like, those terms in the Q&A. I should also say this should go for about, if I go as slowly as I hope, about an hour, and hopefully there'll be time for some discussion after that. I'd more than welcome that. Now, in the second part, I'm going to introduce and briefly analyze an intensely realistic story. So paradoxically, I'm going to tell you or summarize a very realistic story about an inconceivable reality in the second part. And I'm doing all of this under the title Horizons of Thought, the subtitle, or the title Horizons of Thought, for reasons that I hope will become clear, and the subtitle, The Realism of Utopia, in response to the emphasis that the conference brief places on what we could call, a productive tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary. So, well, to begin with, now, in part one, if you like, the realism section, the problem is that it is not entirely obvious what is ordinary and what is new, exceptional, radical, revolutionary, or otherwise transformative. It's also often very difficult to distinguish these things. But rather than try to pin these down, I want to focus on the horizon, or the boundary within which ordinary, everyday reality seems to exist. This is the horizon within which supposedly pragmatic decisions are made, and beyond which, to put it bluntly, lies the unthinkable. The horizon between what seems simply pragmatic and what is, at some level, extraordinary or even unthinkable. But somewhat paradoxically, that is also what constitutes the realism of utopian thought and practice. The paradox makes sense only when you recognize that utopia has very little to do with imagining an ideal or perfect world or designing visionary projects, and much more to do with redefining what is and is not thinkable under the conditions that we normally call real. Hence, the realism. Now, here's an example that puts us in touch with the reality of an urban condition, and will very shortly take us to so-called post-criticality. This is a photo montage made by my partner, Kadambari Bakshi, whom I think some of you have met when she opened an exhibition just out here a few months ago and spoke here. But this is a photo montage that Kadambari did showing the occupation of Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan during the height of the Occupy Wall Street protests in the fall of 2011. But the photo montage deliberately turns away from Wall Street, which is, if you are looking this way, Wall Street is actually at your back. It's behind you, and looks toward Ground Zero. Why? So Ground Zero is right next to Occupy Wall Street. Why? Because that is where Wall Street and everything that it stands for actually is. Wall Street's not really on Wall Street anymore. It's much closer to what is called now Ground Zero. But it was impossible, or unthinkable even, for there to be an Occupy Ground Zero. This was actually debated, and there was a discussion about activism. This is one of the things that was discussed amongst the occupiers about whether or not and in what sense Ground Zero could be addressed. And they deliberately turned away from it because it was too controversial. So it was impossible for there to be an occupied Ground Zero, even as you see in the images here, Fumihiko Maki's mirrored glass skyscraper, that's the building in the middle, which was designed for the developer Larry Silverstein, was visible under construction, towering over Zuccotti Park and over the tents. Now this, by the way, you may remember, is the same Fumihiko Maki who learned from Team 10 and was a member of the Japanese metabolists, who is now unapologetically building a symbol of American military and financial triumph. So much for Team 10. There could be no Occupy Ground Zero or even Occupy SOM, because of course SOM was the one really designing Ground Zero, or Occupy Maki. Occupy Libeskind, etc., etc. None of this, simply because the site of the former World Trade Center was and still is considered by many to be sacred ground, and thus out of bounds for political protest. And yet, this sacred ground is what Wall Street actually is. This is in a sense, the sort of embodied contradiction. This is what Wall Street actually looks like. From the planned 10 million square feet of new Class A office space in the towers, this is all sacred ground, to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, just opened, to the reconstructed World Financial Center. This is the first thing to be reconstructed after 9/11 was this, the World Financial Center. It was like neurotically put back together in exactly the way Cesar Pelli had designed it. To the Goldman Sachs headquarters. Yes, this is Goldman Sachs. The Goldman Sachs, which was built with massive federal subsidies just up the street from the World Financial Center. To the other Goldman Sachs tower, Goldman in New Jersey, just across the river. The two are like right opposite the Hudson River from one another. And then from there to the computer sheds in Secaucus, New Jersey, among other places that have hosted now infamous flash crashes, and so on. All of that is in the other direction from, as it were, Wall Street. Like if you've turned Occupy the other direction, that's what you would be facing. And all of that is what Wall Street and all of its, and in a sense, symbolism actually is today. Not some antiquated neoclassical building with a giant American flag draped over it. This is the official New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street. Or even the old Kevin Roche J.P. Morgan atrium at 60 Wall Street. This is actually on Wall Street, in which many of the Occupy working groups actually met. This is where many of the meetings were taking place for Occupy. for Occupy Wall Street. Ground Zero and its surroundings are as close as you get to something like the real Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. Sacred ground, marked by a memorial, yes, but most visibly with a building once pompously named the Freedom Tower, you know, the tall one, and now mercifully renamed Number 1 World Trade Center, designed by David Childs of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, with a 14-story concrete bunker there at the base, cynically wrapped in an energy-efficient glass at its base. So that's sacred. Now, I have to say, I'm a retired architect. I no longer, despite the fact that Katarina and I have collaborated for many years. Now, kind of, she's doing more her own work, and I'm doing these kinds of things. But so I'm retired as an architect. But back in 2002, when I was still sort of practicing in some way, Katarina and I designed a counter-project for Ground Zero. I can't resist this. I'm actually kind of proud of this. With a memorial that consisted of the two footprints subtracted up in the sky from a massive volume all the way up there. Two black voids surrounded by a luminous fluorescent ceiling, like a office ceiling, the size of the entire site. That was our counter-project. But now that I no longer practice, and I don't even teach studio anymore, I have to content myself with thought experiments, which is sort of thinking out loud with you guys about these kinds of things. Thought experiments like this one. So imagine that the two memorial voids that were actually constructed at Ground Zero were filled with oil instead of water. It would be beautifully, mournfully black, I think, and would smell of real sadness. I mean, actual sadness instead of the sort of, of organic carboniferous decay, oil. Right? But most of all, it would speak something closer to the truth about what the complex of events that we now call 9/11 turned into. And about the actual limits that have been imposed on the historical imagination and on public discourse in the United States and elsewhere. Like the SOM Tower, this little thought experiment, substituting oil for water in the Ground Zero Memorial, is a strictly architectural exercise. It has only to do with the materials of which the work is made, nothing more. In fact, just one material. It's not political commentary, it's architecture. Now, I'm not actually proposing this, but you can imagine that I get into trouble every time I mention this thought in the United States. Why? Because it's understood as a profanity. It's a desecration of a sacred object. Not because it's insensitive to the poetics of memorialization and to the lives lost. On the contrary, I think it'd actually be more fitting and more, in a sense, reflective memorial. But because such a thought, or something like it, actually affirms those poetics, it would be something like a gesture towards the poetic, not away from it, in the name of politics. And the value of all the lives lost, because of course that's what oil immediately brings to mind. All the lives lost in opposition to the real profanity of the site, the sacred, manic, compulsive repetition of business as usual, of which oil in all its forms is simply a reminder. And the architecture, of course, reproduces. Business as usual, then, is another term for so-called reality. The reality in this case, that it was never going to be possible to redirect the public imagination toward a future that did not involve the oil-fueled slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people, rather than a sober reckoning or coming to terms with the contradictions of financial and cultural globalization and of military hegemony. Which brings us to the so-called post-critical turn in architectural theory and practice. In reality, this whole thing, this post-critical whatever, was, I think, a profoundly provincial matter. It was, at best, it was a storm in the teacup of the Atlantic that was limited mainly to academic architectural circles on the North American East Coast. It didn't even really make it to the West Coast. And initially, at least, to a small corner of Western Europe namely the Netherlands. That was at least where I encountered it, mostly in Europe in the early days of this debate. Anyway, utterly provincial in that sense, if you think about what was at stake here. But as it turned out, Ground Zero was one of its flashpoints, which is why I'm beginning with this example. This was a time when architecture was very much in the news, as any number of publics, local, national, and international. In fact, Joan and I worked on this together. We taught a studio together about this. Debated the reconstruction of the World Trade Center site. Eventually, as you know, a limited competition was held, the winner of which was Daniel Libeskind, who was hired to design a master plan, a kind of master plan for the site. All the while, SOM were working behind the scenes. And in fact, I think the full story of their involvement and influence from the first day, from like basically September 12th or something like that, that full story has not yet been told. It remains to be told. SOM's role here. All of which happened to coincide, and not by chance. This is, again, this is not an accident, but I think it coincides with a series of popular arguments in the Architectural Academy, basically on the American East Coast, that combine two things. An anti-intellectual assault on architectural theory, and especially on the tradition of critical theory. That's the first point about post-critical. And an explicit acceptance of what I have just described as business as usual, as a baseline reality that a supposedly more pragmatic discourse and practice could ride, like a wave. You remember all those metaphors of surfing the waves and all of that. That's, okay. Now, admittedly, what I'm describing is a kind of pastiche of a number of different and sometimes divergent positions lumped together. If you really want to be scientific about it, there are all kinds of branches. Still, it's not inaccurate. I think it's sort of basically accurate. My own contribution, as we heard, to these debates was, I think, really, yes, there were a couple of shorter articles, but really in this one article published in 2005 in the Harvard Design magazine titled Critical of What? Toward a Utopian Realism. And I was amazed those days that people were reading this, because it was just a little article about Ground Zero, and I'm flattered that people seem to continue to do so. But anyway, I'll just try to explain what that was about. It was an attempt to connect the assault on theory with the reactionary politics that cast a long shadow over the design competition for the reconstruction of Ground Zero, as not just a thing that was happening in the States, but really was emblematic of architectural culture in the West, particularly. Now, in brief, I argued there that the post-critical position framed a number of the pseudo-utopian competition entries. In other words, that there was kind of latent post-criticality, if you like, in many of these, in most of the competition entries, and particularly the design submitted by the group that called itself, without embarrassment, I have to say, I remain amazed, the United Architects. Remember, this was a group that proposed, with renderings like this, a crypto-Christian cathedral. They called this a cathedral, their term, cathedral, as an architectural response to militant Islam. They proposed a Christian cathedral as a response to militant Islam. This was, I don't know how conscious, but it was explicitly proposed. The point is not so much that they or their colleagues consciously aligned, as I said, it may have been unconscious, but the point was not so much that the work was consciously aligned with the paranoid triumphalism that saturated politics and culture in the United States and in much of the West at that time. Nevertheless, it was a scandal and remains a scandal. The point is that the project submitted by the United Architects simply worked with that triumphalism as a perfectly natural feature of pragmatic reality. It was merely pragmatic. And hence was basically sort of, in a sense, encapsulated the contradictions of architectural culture and the debates of architectural culture at that time vis-a-vis, in a sense, macro politics. Therefore, intentionally or not, their project internalized the barbarism of the American response to 9/11 as a horizon within which it set to work. This is the horizon. Perfectly natural. It was perfectly okay to do all of this because that was, in a sense, the tone, the zeitgeist, if you like. The horizon within which any criticism, or even any refusal of the paranoid call to triumphantly rebuild, anything that objected to this kind of paranoia, was off limits, out of the question, beyond the line of what was pragmatically thinkable. So that's, in a sense, an extreme example of this kind of horizon that's built into discourse. In that sense, in complying with the demand for visionary proposals, because they were explicitly asked to produce visionary proposals for Ground Zero, architects were operating in the service of an emboldened sense of empire and war on all fronts and not against it. So they were actively participating. The pseudo-theoretical language of the post-critical was nothing more than an alibi for doing that. Of course, in the end, none of the designs from that competition were built. Nor did the post-critical theoretical stance ever develop into much. I mean, I think it actually all fizzled, basically. But that's because both turned out to be redundant to the needs of the system they served. They were necessary for a short period of time, and then they became redundant. They merely prepared the ground for more blatant mixtures of politics and theology. But at that moment, something like a visionary architecture, as is a phrase you heard constantly, unbound from self-critique, was a necessary ingredient to stir the public imagination focused on Ground Zero. Moreover, far from simply commemorating the lives lost, that site had become what I called at the time an aesthetic training ground. An aesthetic training ground for the militarization of everyday life. Not because it put tanks in the street of New York, because of course that was reserved for Kabul and Baghdad, but because it put architecture there. And the point being ultimately that the architecture and the tanks are related, and they're constitutively related, and that's just how it is. Anyway, given such a situation and the impasse that it seems to, what do you do in this kind of thing? The impasse that it seems to represent, we could ask the perennial question, what is to be done? What do you do? What is to be done? Now, at the time, my own response was deliberately vague. Utopian realism is what. By that, I did not and do not mean to propose either return to classical utopianism or a realist accommodation of the status quo. Nor by utopia or utopian do I mean an ideal city or some mystical desire for a perfect world. I simply mean the performative, practical, real, pragmatic thought, the practical thought that things could be different, that history did not have to turn out this way, and that what is not the same as what ought to be. And by realism, I mean only that what is commonly taken as the non-negotiable ground on which any given work is executed is, in fact, subject to change. It's hard to change, but it is historically subject to change. That realism, then, does not mean deferral to so-called reality. On the contrary, whether that reality is defined as capitalism and its markets or as imperial power and its needs and desires. Realism is the historical recognition that all of these things are subject to change. That, in fact, they do change, and that, in fact, as Marx recognized, their own internal dynamics require them to change. Another sort of dialectical twist. Utopian realism, in the sense that I intended it, is therefore the highly specific, detailed, technical, and utterly real thought that things could change. That, in fact, they must change, and even more, that they must be made to change differently. It's very simple, very pragmatic. Now, of course, there is, after all, some arrogance in asserting that things must change and that they must do so in this or that manner. But there's also an assumption of responsibility. You take responsibility when you say that. Again, utopia is a historically delimited, situated, pragmatic, materially conditioned thought, and not some ideal, immaterial, or universal dream. The thought is a material thing. This is important to, that this is, in a sense, the premise, the underlying premise. And architecture participates exactly in the materialities of thought. As such, it is subject to the tangible material constraints that constitute what we call reality. Only certain thoughts are possible under certain historical conditions and certain arrangements of power, including the thought that things must change. So the extreme example I gave you of Ground Zero was a situation in which it was, at some level, truly unthinkable, given the powers that were bearing down on that site, that anything other than some triumphalist response was possible. Of course, many people were thinking like that, but they didn't get, heard. These very real concrete horizons, in that sense, define what is and is not thinkable in a given situation and at a given moment. And they can be redrawn, with some difficulty, but by the seemingly abstract thought called utopia. To return, in concluding the first part of this talk, to the architectural debates then, in assessing the cultural politics surrounding the redesign of Ground Zero, it's important to remember the historical conditions in which these were cast. The anger and wounds of 9/11 removed from their historical and political context, and the near-total American triumphalism in righteous support of military action. Combined with the parochial debates in architecture regarding the alleged futility of critique, and hence of dissent or fully worked out alternatives, these conditions effectively foreclosed or closed down the possibility of a genuinely critical, progressive, not even to say utopian, or at least peaceful response to the situation on the ground. To put it another way, the ritual incantations in architecture, as in culture at large, proclaiming the need for a new realism or a new pragmatism with a small p, since these have almost nothing to do with philosophical pragmatism, these seemed finally to have exorcised, to got rid of, or expelled what we can call utopia's ghost. And by this I mean that they have expelled or neutralized the specter or the virtual possibility or the thinkability of systemic historical change. Somewhat paradoxically, in the aftermath of 9/11, the most common form that this took was a pseudo-utopian statement that everything has changed. So beware when somebody says that everything has changed. It usually means nothing has changed. This statement was repeated innumerable times from positions of political power, and like many other demagogic speech acts, this is the actual pragmatist element of the argument. This was a speech act. It had the practical effect of changing everything. If enough powerful people say everything has changed, it changes the rules of the game. We knew then and we know now that it's not true. In fact, 9/11 changed very little. However, backed up by power and by an open-ended state of emergency, the false statement that everything had changed not only authorized previously unthinkable military action and political repression, it effectively blocked organized dissent. The statement, therefore, helped to realize the anti-critical dreams of global capital's cultural representatives, including many architects and architectural theorists. Announcing that everything has changed had the pragmatic effect of changing the rules of the game, both demonstrating and denying that, to borrow a slogan from the alter globalization movements, another world is possible, since another world seemed already to have arrived too soon in the form of the post-9/11 nightmare, which I'm afraid is still being lived in many ways. Of course, what happened in America is not what happened elsewhere, and again, I apologize for the provincialism of this, but I hope you recognize that it's meant to resonate. We are familiar with the many and diverse forms taken by dissent, including here in Spain, quite importantly, and by alternatives to the New World Order that have been enacted in the global streets. But before returning to the story with which I began, I want to conclude the first part of this lecture with just one more image. Now, somewhat uncannily, the violent destruction of Minoru Yamasaki's World Trade Center, with thousands of lives lost, had been preceded by the demolition in 1972 of another important Yamasaki building, the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis, just as the World Trade Center was nearing completion. So just as the World Trade Center was opening, this was being demolished. The two projects are genealogically connected. Pruitt-Igoe's demolition marks the beginning of the end, in the West, of the Keynesian welfare state. And the World Trade Center's opening marks the consolidation, assisted by that same state, of neoliberal capital under what has come to be called financial globalization, and hence the other Wall Street that I showed you after. It took about 30 years for all of that to come into being, at least in the city of New York. Now, this backdrop suggests at least one straightforward answer to the question, what is to be done? Simply reopen the housing question. Everywhere worldwide. Very simple, pragmatic response. If public or social housing, which was the real target of many postmodernist critiques of the modern city, and that's really, I think, what post-critical is kind of postmodernism. And social housing is the sort of fetish object of these critiques. And yes, it materialized the contradictions of the social democratic or socialist state, surely. But its demolition or privatization is part of an across-the-board neoliberal turn, we have to recognize. In that sense, social housing marks a line or horizon internal to the post-war city. Right? This is where the line is. It's the line in the sand. You cross that line, and it's basically done. Right? It's in a sense the last line. Now, crossing that line leaves nothing safe from privatization and answers the housing question in favor of predatory capital. Basically, privatizing social housing, demolishing all these things that have been going on all over the world, and at the expense of those whose lives are made most precarious by the new economic arrangements. In other words, people living in these places. Reopening the housing question, beginning with Engels' famous text on the subject of 1872, does not mean opposing the near absolute sovereignty of markets with the insidious authority of the bureaucratic state. It's not states versus markets in this old-fashioned way, because these two cannot be separated and haven't been for a long time. It does, however, mean learning to live in the North and the West, as well as in the East and the South, like basically all over the world, with the material, institutional, and symbolic ruins of the socialist project in its many forms, and with the specters of utopia that still haunt those ruins. It does not mean reconstructing those ruins as they were, or bringing their ghosts back to life. But it does mean staging within them an unexpected return, as ghosts tend to do. That's what they tend to do. They come back. Ghosts, they just show up. So Utopia's ghost shows up just where you don't expect it. Now, which brings me to the second, shall we say, utopian part of my talk, or more obviously, or more classically utopian. Now, to put you in the right frame of mind, well, first I have to show you, this is the flag. When I published Utopia's Ghost, my son, who was at the time, I think, 8 years old, designed the flag for Utopia. In fact, this is the flag for the Utopia football team, the Utopia soccer team. I think, after all, we need a flag. Anyway, so to put you in the right frame of mind, I want to change scales rather abruptly and remind you that Earth, after all, Earth itself, our planet, is, after all, merely a locus, a locale, just a fragile little place. It's a place, if you like, to speak that language. And in fact, on August 25th, 2012, or thereabouts, the Voyager 1 space probe left our solar system. Whoops, not that. There. This little thing left our solar system. This is an object from the 1970s. It's great. It's like, it goes... so it's kind of contemporaneous with the World Trade Center and Pruitt-Igoe and all that. Now, we know this because on that day, that earthly day, because if only Earth has days, like August 25th, 2012, the density of ionized plasma particles the probe encountered while hurtling through space decreased sharply, indicating that it had crossed the horizon created by the sun's magnetic field. So a different horizon this time. That horizon forms what astrophysicists call the heliosphere, a plasma bubble within which our solar system is enclosed. So we're just inside this bubble. Its radius is approximately 122 astronomical units, so, not so big, or AUs as they call it. One AU, however, is approximately 150 million kilometers in length, the average distance separating Earth from the sun. Which means that the radius of the heliosphere, and hence the solar system, is roughly 18.2 billion kilometers. So it's a pretty big bubble. It's sort of Buckminster Fuller dome, like made really big. Now, Voyager 1 was launched by the American Space Agency, NASA, in 1977. It's this thing. Its primary mission had been to explore Jupiter and Saturn. That's what it was really doing while it was closer to us. And in late 1980, after passing closely by Saturn's largest moon, Titan, which is of particular scientific interest due to the atmospheric properties that it's thought to share with the primeval Earth, the probe began its journey out of the solar system. As it did so, it continued to record observational data, the quantity of which was limited by the capacity of the probe's 1970s-style 8-track tape storage banks. So it has 8-track tapes. Do you know, remember, you got Pink Floyd, like basically, I don't even know if you get the whole Wall album on an 8-track tape cassette, but it had like nothing, storage banks. Nevertheless, NASA was able to extract sufficient data from the now obsolete machine to confirm with relative confidence its historic crossing, which will be repeated, in fact, soon by its companion probe, Voyager 2. Now, along with the data comes a certain melancholy. Unlike the ongoing exploration, for example, of Mars by NASA's Curiosity rover, or there's Mars, my home planet, being a Martian, or indeed Voyager 1's earlier encounter with Titan, there's Titan, both of which test the possibility of, so these are classically utopian projects, they test the possibility of extraterrestrial life or future human habitation. Passage beyond the heliosphere suggests little more than profound interstellar loneliness. The echoes of anthropocentrism, audible in references to earthly scale, such as the Earth-to-Sun measurement of the astronomical unit, vanish like the diminishing signals from the probe's transmitter. Any remaining reference to human experience, including the human lifespan or even humanity's recorded history, is effectively cancelled by the realization that Voyager 1 will not encounter another star or another solar system for another 40,000 years or so. 40,000 years it's going to take to get to another one. So it's going to be very lonely for a very long time. Still sending its 8-track tapes data back. Anyway, my purpose in telling this story is to extend the problem of the horizon in a manner, the kind of cognitive problem of the horizon, like what you can imagine, in a manner that correlates a certain inhuman scale with a certain kind of thought. To explain further what the terms utopia and realism might mean, because this is real, To do that, we need to fasten our seatbelts for just a bit and read a few books. These, in fact, I recommend them for the summer if you like. They're quite long, but they're good for the beach. The year this time is not 2001, but 2026. So, just 12 years from now. The spaceship Ares carries a multicultural group of 100 scientists and engineers, plus one stowaway, on a 9-month journey to colonize Mars, following in the wake of Curiosity. Right? Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars, does not quite begin with this scene. Rather, it begins with the assassination some years later of the colonists' charismatic leader, and hints at the power struggle to follow. It's a book about the politics of Mars, or a series about the politics of Mars, basically. The book's titles, which encompass some 1,957 pages of intricate, realistic detail, it's absolutely realistic, like beautifully realistic. In the best utopian tradition, because that's the classic characteristic of utopias, they just give you endless detail about like how you make the food in the cafeteria of the spaceship, and and so on, how the toilets work, etc. So, anybody go to fundamentals yet? You'll see a lot of toilets in the Biennale, spaceships. Anyway, so these titles refer to the different stages of Mars colonization. So red for the lifeless geological purity of the planet as found, the kind of tabula rasa, without a viable atmosphere to speak of. Green for the network of verdant settlements, of green settlements that appear first under climate-controlled sort of bucky domes, and later for the gradual appearance of a manufactured, oxygenated atmosphere, along with the artificial thaw of polar ice, and the consequent spread of primal vegetation genetically engineered to thrive in the harsh conditions of this new atmosphere. And blue for the final planetary melt, something like what we're experiencing, in a controlled deluge that produces seas and continents, along with a comprehensive Earth-like atmosphere and weather, in which humans can at last live without prosthetic breathing devices or insulated suits. That's the span, the narrative arc of this story, from red Mars to an Earth-like, verdant, living planet. Now, this vastly accelerated science fiction story, kind of covering a centuries-long process of warming the red planet, wrapping it in oxygen and nitrogen, and propagating animal and vegetal species. It's called terraforming. It's the source of most, if not all, of the planet's political turmoil over the course of these 3 volumes of the story. Terraforming is actually a staple. It's a kind of relatively common conceit in science fiction, with some basis, in fact, in existing, so-called real techniques for what is sometimes called geoengineering. And of the story's main characters, nearly all of them are members of the so-called first 100 of colonists, or their offspring, whose intertwined lives the story follows. Each character represents, sort of symbolically or metonymically really, a distinct political shade or position. So it's a kind of allegory, basically, of earthly politics. So relative to the terraforming process, it's a kind of environmental politics, basically. Many of them move in and out of newly organized political parties that sort of parody some of our own parties, of which there are over 20. There are 20 political parties on Mars in this, either as leaders or as charismatic symbols. At the 2 poles of the political debate are fundamentalist Reds, who want at all costs to conserve the planet's barren geology in its primal state, its redness, and the developmentalist Greens, who advocate something called viriditas, or the proliferation of life in every corner. Both of these have quasi-theological dimensions. The most extreme Reds, represented by a renegade geologist, practice a kind of a monastic asceticism devoted to the primal beauty of the planet's barren surface, while the more devout Greens hew to a cult of viriditas, or kind of greenness, led by a guru-like bioengineer. So, this is, as I said, it's a kind of allegory of environmental politics. Terraforming in this setup, and I'm going to just go through a little bit, if you bear with me, a couple of layers of the story in order to play out the allegory, basically. So I gave you a kind of real political situation. Now we have an allegorical one. Terraforming is a dialectical procedure by which both a particular a priori reality, the reality of Martian geology in this case, which you saw from, really does exist and really is kind of red, and it's this sort of dialectic of that and its potential human constructions come into view. So it's really a kind of modernist drama. That's, the kind of tabula rasa of this red desert, basically, and the possibility of building a new world on that space. And they play off of one another dialectically, rather than simply one order of being replaced by the other, green replacing red. To this is added another dialectic, which is that of Earth and Mars. Now, in a reading, and here comes the theory, sorry. In a reading or a critique of this trilogy, it's really a reading, a sympathetic reading, the literary theorist Frederick Jameson suggests that this axis, the Earth-Mars axis, secures the properly utopian character of Robinson's series, of this series. As the dystopia of increasingly more dire conditions on Earth and the resulting interplanetary migration put increased pressure on the fragile Martian ecosystem. So this is like rural to urban migration of the sort that Engels talked about in the housing question, except on a planetary scale. Earth is now the new rural, in a sense. It's a site of obsolescence, of obsolete productivity, and Mars is, in a sense, the new city. Now this puts a lot of pressure on the Martian ecosystem. A space elevator, which is set up so that ships can dock up outside the atmosphere and then take the elevator down, and then it is destroyed, replaced, and eventually multiplied. This is the connection between Earth and Mars, together with the 54.6 million kilometers separating these 2 planets, and the variety of techno-social arrangements devised to span that distance, Earth-Mars, Earth-Mars. This is the dialectic, basically, of utopia and realism. All of this is the structural equivalent of the geoengineered trench. So that distance between Earth and Mars, you remember Thomas More and Utopia, there's a trench, and it's produced by engineers. It's just cut to separate the island, the isthmus of Utopia, to turn it into an island and make it into, Utopos, a non-place. An asymmetrical back and forth runs between a still recognizable Earth, which in the story is now ruled by metanational corporations and weak states and subject to extreme forms of global warming and overpopulation, and eventually following a second revolution, an agonistically democratic and pluralistic Mars. So Mars becomes a kind of agonistic, democratic utopia in the story. The distance from Earth, according to Jameson, elicits the cognitive estrangement necessary to achieve on Mars what he calls a polyphonic utopianism, or, in his words, a struggle between a whole range of utopian alternatives about which the trilogy deliberately fails to conclude. So Mars is a kind of thought experiment in this story. It's the opposite of the ground zero thought experiment with the oil that I'm talking about. It's a positive thought experiment for working out possible societies. Now, the result is a kind of decentralized ecological anarcho-socialism, actually. That's what actually happens on Mars in the story. Among the trilogy's tour de force technical conceits, which Robinson describes with a literary realism that pulsates with exhaustive parascientific detail, among these are the exploitation of the planet's geology and hydrology, the epic harnessing of solar, and he's, by the way, he blogs a lot, and you can read, he's recommending these things for Earth to deal with global warming. The exploitation of the geology and hydrology, the epic harnessing of solar energy with a giant space mirror, the mining of satellites, the chemical construction of an atmosphere, and even the evolution of a new quasi-species of taller, more agile humans in the diminished Martian gravity. However, so all of it has an architecture, it has an infrastructure, it has an engineering, and it has a program, and it has sort of clients too. However, more mysterious is the existence of something called the Gerontological Treatments, or merely the treatments for short. These are treatments, biological treatments, medical treatments, that have to be re-administered every few decades, which virtually eliminate disease and prolong human life by an unknown extent. So this, you follow basically the same characters through several hundred years of this development. And in fact, it's the basis for the whole utopia on Mars is the fact that a subset of humanity is treated biomedically, such as to prolong their life in such a way. So this is a biopolitics for the readers of Foucault and so on. That's what actually this novel is doing. Now, two of the original Mars scientists actually developed them in the story, and from the outset, these treatments are the basis for a socioeconomic apartheid that rebounds racially, gradually constructing two competing categories of humans. On Earth, access to the treatments requires either considerable private means, membership, in other words, if you're rich enough, you can get these treatments, or if you work for a metanational corporation, you get them as a sort of employee benefit, or if you're a Mars colonist. So a participant in the utopian experiment, you get this treatment and get to live hundreds of years. Anyone without such access is condemned to live entirely outside the sphere in which the trilogy's principal contest between these red and green utopias occurs. So in other words, if you don't have access, and this is basically what I'm describing allegorically here, is urban life today. This is what cities are in the so-called real world. This is the partition between those who live life inside the bubble and those who live life outside the bubble. And this is, again, in a sense, a kind of allegory of that. Now, Robinson, the author, portrays the main consequence of this apartheid as ecological. He doesn't really pick up on this so much, I think, in the sense that this longevity leads to all kinds of ecological crises and so on, too many people, a whole host of problems on Earth. But what I really want you to, in a sense, recognize, I mean, this is, in a sense, the paradox of these kinds of thought experiments. That in order to participate in the experiment, one requires, this is this debate about being in an academy or in a university and whatever, a certain status. One has to be, as it were, inside in one way or another in order to play the game. In that sense, in this story, which is playing the game quite self-consciously, the most immediate consequences of the apartheid are biomedical. They're biopolitical divisions among classes and other groupings, of humans. The starkest division, separating those who have received the treatments from those who have not, is in a sense the most precarious. It produces, at some level, more immediate damage than the impending ecological crisis, although obviously these things go together. So basically what I'm saying is that, if you look at a big city today, you have two things happening. You have, in a sense, an absolutely rampant and irresponsible overdevelopment that contributes in our side of things, in the architects and urbanist side of things, to the processes that melt glaciers and produce the need to migrate to Mars. But what you also have is a division of the population. You have a very stark division of the population, in various kinds of insides and outsides, ultimately and epistemologically into those who are in the position to participate in some kind of utopian alternative experiment, and those who simply have no access to this apparatus in the first place. And I'll just quickly summarize that if you read Jameson's critique of this, he doesn't necessarily highlight this, I think, sufficiently. He's more interested in the ways in which Mars acts as a kind of mirror, a kind of dialectical sort of laboratory in which the realities of our own realities can be, in a sense, reflected metaphorically and experimented with. But the point being here that in this particular kind of story, in order to experiment with a given reality, one has to, there is an inherent restructuring of subjectivity such that there is a subject who experiments with and a subject who is simply outside, or a population that is simply outside the horizons of the thought experiment itself. Anyway, okay. Now, and that is what is real. What's real about this is this division, right? That's what we're in a sense the reality that let's say the various crises, whether they're financial, ecological, social, political, etc., come together, is at. A way of figuring that in, to return back to the ground zero example, is if you know that there are names listed on that memorial, those are the names of the victims of this series of events in New York. But that whole process set into motion a series of other divisions events in which hundreds of thousands of unnamed victims came into being as victims as a result of the initial naming and the rendering sacred of that ground. Does that make sense? In other words, that to produce a special place in one place is at some level automatically to produce an outside, a space that does not enter into the circuitries of representation, including the representation of possible alternatives to that world. So it's a little bit of a tricky formulation, and I'd be happy to discuss it further. But it all comes down to the question of not simply what must change, like how do we change the world, but what must change so that change will be thinkable and thinkable for everyone. Right? Thinkable for everyone. Hence, the utopian question posed in the Mars trilogy is not red or green, keep the planet the way it is, one kind of ecological solution or another, or even Earth or Mars, fix the Earth or escape to Mars. It is, how could this be? How could the dialectic of utopia and realism, a contest among the elites, be built on another, even more stark reality that passes nearly unnoticed by this dialectic, this division of in a sense, of humanity itself into those who are able to participate, in a position to participate in these debates, and those that are not. So finally, to return to Voyager's exit from the Heliosphere. Among the most fantastical sections of the Mars trilogy are those in the third book, Blue Mars, which describe the further colonization of the outer solar system. There, Mars's original pluralism and the anti-capitalist utopia that it in fact becomes in the story is multiplied into the diverse characteristics imposed on various terraforming missions by the specific geological, meteorological, and atmospheric conditions of the other planets and their satellites. So basically the whole solar system becomes a series of little outposts. In the myriad technological, cultural, and political economic responses to these conditions. Among the most architecturally innovative of these is a really great one, a superstudio-like continuous monument that's called the Terminator, that is on Mercury. And it glides, it's on tracks, it's a city on tracks, and it glides slowly along these tracks around Mercury's equator. Its imperceptible, steady movement is being propelled by the differential expansion of the tracks. This is the kind of realism of science fiction. So the tracks expand just a little bit as the planet rotates, and those tracks are exposed to the heat of the sun. And that expansion pushes the city along, right? Makes sense, right? So the differential expansion of the part of the tracks that are in the sun, not in the sun, pushes this crazy city along. That's the realism of this kind of fiction. You have to explain it in that level of technical detail. Anyway, it's a pure super studio project. It therefore keeping the city just behind the horizon in the shadow. It just keeps pushing it more and more away from the sun because, of course, the city would melt if it was exposed to the sun. Others of these include Jupiter's asteroid belt, which now has mines and settlements, and Jupiter's moons, the Galileans, Callisto, Ganymede, Io, and Europa, all of which have big illumination projects to compensate for the minimal direct sunlight they receive. Again, more technical detail. Still another is the restless settler colony on Oberon, one of Uranus's moons, who have already set their sights on Pluto and its largest satellite, Charon. So the whole process is going out to the edge of the heliosphere, as far as Voyager has gone. This whole imaginary process. So by the conclusion of the third book, the entire solar system has become to Mars what Mars had been to Earth. A colonial frontier, of course, which is what utopia is generally, a colonial frontier of one kind or the other, in which are reflected all the aspirations, conflicts, and ideological struggles of the home planet. Now, however, these are no longer spread in microcosm and small settlements on Mars. They're spread in macrocosm at this incredibly inhuman scale across the whole solar system. But this is where think about the madness of this thing, okay? By the time you get to the third book in that series. This is where the reality of little old Voyager 1 here, having crossed the gaseous frontier and left to hurtle through the interstellar void, joins the utopianism of the Mars trilogy. As a scientific probe, its weakening signals to continue to record actual human encounter with the obdurate matter of the universe. In a fashion as realist as any of Robinson's fictional scientists, fictional cities or heroes and all of those stories that I just told you about how this occupation of the solar system was to take place. So it's just as real, just as technical as that. But its hidden utopianism does not lie in the distant promise of one day populating the solar system with human settlements. A promise that, as the Mars trilogy implies, merely lays out for inspection all the conflicts and contradictions of earthly existence. That's not what utopia is. It's not about moving to Mars. Nor does its utopianism of this little machine, which is also its realism, lie in what it conceals. Lie in the promise of yet farther horizons, of finding another place to go besides our own solar system. Its utopianism, which is also its realism, lies in what it conceals as much as what it reveals. That the horizons of thought are where the sky and the ground meet. In other words, where the kind of imagination of possible futures, possible alternatives, and what's actually happening, what you can't see, outside the horizon of that imagination, actually happening around on the ground. That moment of contact, the horizon of utopian thought, constitutes precisely that thought. Such a horizon encompasses the 122 astronomical units that now separate us from this machine. All of human history is contained within that distance, as are the a priori conditions of our existence. Among those conditions is the inability to see simultaneously the starry skies above and the ground on which we stand. Both of these are real. But truly utopian thought requires that the question of how to inhabit the skies is preceded by the question of how to inhabit the earth, as we saw in the first part of the lecture. In a sense, how to deal with, as it were, the demand by capitalist development and military triumph for visionary architecture, reopen the housing question, bring things back down to earth. Utopia, then, is a down-to-earth thought, as mundane and, I'm afraid, as unexciting as reopening the housing question. But you know, a question that can be reopened in ways that I just tried to explain allegorically through, you know, imagining living elsewhere, if only to come into contact with its paradoxes and its internal thresholds, horizons, and blind spots. Because after all, it is here on Earth that the real horizons lie. Thanks. Yeah, I don't know. You have a mic? You can shout. They can hear you.
I presented here an article about an architect,
Yona Friedman, yeah. Science fiction.
Utopia, feasible utopia.
Right.
So it, basically his thesis was that it's for to be able to make a utopia or collective project possible, there is a communication process, and the bigger the group is, the communication gets impossible.
Right.
Okay. So it makes me remember this example of Occupy Wall Street, when there was CISEC making a speech, and the other people were repeating.
Yes, of course, the human microphone. Yes, ironic that you asked for the microphone.
Today the argument here we saw what was the relation between criticism and society.
Yeah.
And if we have any option, the architects or as critics, to reach society. So I will ask you if you consider so much important on how do you consider communication process between architects and society to reach, for example, so this so much interesting movements like Occupy Wall Street or some political movements here.
Yeah.
How are we limited by communication that is in fact a limitation of our brain, our biological...
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. It's a very good question. And a difficult one, I think, at least, because it's not obvious. I think Friedman is wrong in that case. I mean, you understand why he says what he says, and many people, you know, this is why I did, you know, the science fiction thing at the end, it's like to try to at least, you know, you don't have to understand the whole story or even get the whole picture. It's basically that there's this enormous, the scale of the solar system at which this supposed utopia is being imagined is the main problem, in a sense. You know, that the relationship, you talk about a communication problem, Earth to Mars, you know, all of that, right? And no, you know, technological communication is not going to solve that sort of thing. But on the other hand, the Occupy and many of the political, you know, sort of branches around the world, not just in New York, obviously, around the world, invested and still invest very heavily, I think, in face-to-face communication, in what is perceived as unmediated. So the exact opposite of the tape decks, the 8-track tape that's here. You know, the hand signals, that you're supposed to go like that, and then the human mic and all that. Now, that, it seems to me, is a false problem in that respect. I mean, in other words, I think in some branches of this, of Occupy, I think stated the problem in a way that was a bit misleading, as an alternative between face-to-face political organization and something more structured, whether it was loosely structured or more distant, generally. Or at the scale of the entire planet, for example, at the scale of an entire city, or whatever the instruments would be. They would be the instruments of the state, of technical media, like the internet, and so on. The question is one of mediation. I think that's, your example, Friedman was one of those architects who liked networks, right? But that's not the only way, I think, to think about the problem of mediating communication, as kind of spreading networks all over the place. There are other ways to do that. Institutions also mediate these kinds of communications. And housing is one of those. So I'm just going to give you the concrete. This is now back to the sort of more pragmatic part. And at Ground Zero, during the Occupy, there were a lot of architecture students, some of my students, and Columbia people of the various architecture schools from around town were participating, as were some. We were all participating one way or the other in kind of layers of these communications, and I remember going down to a couple of meetings down in that atrium, the Kevin Roche atrium. There was a group called Town Planning. Now, in Spanish, maybe that doesn't translate, but in English, town planning is like a 19th century idea. It's Ebenezer Howard. It's like the town planners of the Occupy Wall Street. And that, I think, reflected a little bit the sort of slightly romantic disposition of some of the things. And what the town planners were doing at Zuccotti Park, face-to-face, sitting at those tables, were discussing whether to have one big tent or lots of little tents. That was one of the debates. Anarchists versus socialists, basically. Socialists, one big tent, anarchists, lots of little tents. The anarchists won, and you got a lot of little tents, and you had a communication issue. Read that as a kind of metaphor. Almost the opposite again as the problem. It's actually exactly the same problem that is followed through these stories of Robinson on Mars. It really is. It's like, except the scale is different. But it's the same epistemological and political problem. How to form a collective. And what is the architecture of that collective? Is it green? Is it red? Is it in a bubble? Is it not? And so they really were playing this out. But what I found, in a sense, insufficiently mediated by that, and that's why I wrote about. We heard about some. I wrote a couple of articles about this online. Was that the more classical political subject of housing was not in the middle of the financial. Of course, this is right after the foreclosure crisis. That was not really being debated, like housing policy or even typology, or public housing versus other forms of housing. None of these things were really being systematically debated on those tables, because that was seen to be too mediated, too much to do with the state, too much to do with large organizations, large institutions, housing agencies and whatever. What was instead, the response to the foreclosure crisis, which is I think a very important one, and there was a discussion about activism in the previous panel, so I'm reflecting some of that, had to do with people standing in front of somebody's house that was about to be taken away by a bank and protecting that house. That was being organized at those tables. But to make the connection, which would be like making the connection between Yona Friedman and let me think of and Sal, the Portuguese housing program that CISA participated in, socialist housing basically. Same years. Those two things go together historically. The sort of dream of living without anything, and the institutionalization, temporary and fragile as it has been, of housing policy practice and design. So it's like a little example of if you're just in the face-to-face world, it's very, very difficult to debate those kinds of issues. So on the other hand, the face-to-face world was necessary in order for those issues to be opened up in that particular way. So different modes and degrees of mediation is essentially what, I respond with. Yeah, yeah. There are various.
I want to say first that even though the first part of the lecture seems to me to be very daring, because to be critical with
Very
daring,
Oh.
very courageous, because being critical with the September 11th thing in the United States has to be quite difficult. I don't know if
You get in trouble.
lecture in the United States.
Well, I have. I mean, I wrote about it, and
So, but I would prefer to go
yeah.
to the outer space.
To the outer space, yeah. Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And I think that this is a question
Yeah.
I would like to ask you is that in order to fabricate that utopian society in Mars, you
Yeah.
have to rely on a highly developed technology.
Yes.
That's a fact. And in order to, so you need to put into play a tremendous amount of pragmatism,
Right.
of investment. So once you get there, you get the anarchist colonial
Right.
entity that once you've gone through all that effort
Right.
on investment in technology, sits down and says, what's this worth? Is this the right thing to do?
Right.
It becomes the critical point.
Right. That's true. Right. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So in order to be critical, you need a huge investment in technology.
Yeah.
In order to be able to ask the profound questions, so to speak, you need the pragmatism.
Right.
Of technology.
That's right. Yeah.
That's where we are. In order to be critical, we need technology. Technology to be and there's no way to be critical.
Yeah. No, it's.
Technology does not allow neither for criticism, nor for utopian, nor for
Yeah.
an ideological stand that questions the fundamentals, because it's fundamentally moving forward,
Yeah.
and does not allow for being too critical.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But actually, these two things are related a little bit. I will give you one more detail that. Kim Stanley Robinson, the author of that series, he's a kind of Marxist. Really, if you kind of read his politics, sort of an anarcho-syndicalist or something like that. But he was a student of Frederick Jameson's. So all of this is conscious in his, he's basically channeling, American academic Marxism into a kind of allegory of, other worlds. And Jameson, one of his teachers, is famously a theorist of utopia. So, and then the teacher writes then Jameson actually wrote about his students' books. He wrote these articles. Anyway, so it's not surprising then that you have something in this allegory. You have something like what you have in Marx, that capitalism produces the necessity of its own, dialectically its own critique. So, for what you're calling technology more broadly could be called capitalist development, a la Tafuri. I mean, basically that's what this is a story about. It's a story about the post-industrial city now, going planetary. And so, for example, the ones who get to Mars first are these corporate types. So it's not just technological; they call them metanational corporations that build the space elevator and build the ships and do all this stuff you're talking about. In this kind of, so you have a kind of classically Marxist dialectic of then capitalism sets the stage for its own then subsequent revolutionary challenge. What I wanted to add to that, and this is why I keep insisting, I just did it fairly quickly and schematically, but I hope at least it's schematically clear, that another precondition for that, which is also technological, but it can take different forms, it's typically infrastructural, is a division of the population. Not so much into classes, but into what Marx called the lumpenproletariat and then everybody else. Basically, all those outside the city gates, outside the horizon, those are the ones in this story who will never get to Mars. They have no possibility of participating in this political experiment or revolution or whatever it is, precisely because they haven't received these longevity treatments, these biomedical treatments that enable them to live in that way. So, and the funny thing about this story is they don't say very much about it. It just sees that that's just a conceit. It's just part of the story. You have to accept that's just part of the trick is, to get to this metaphor. But I think it's more than that. I think, and this is why I was insisting in these various asides about contemporary cities. If you look at any city, this city included, I'm sure, you will find these lines. And those lines are not just class lines. They are, of course, classically class lines, and hence they have the potential, whether to do with access to services, access to, technologically advanced sort of lifestyles or whatever. But they're also lines that are tending towards the division, the more primary divisions of the human populations themselves, into those who count and those who don't count, simply, basically. Those who can be named and those who are not named on the memorials. Those who exist at some epistemological level, and those who are not even numbers, as was the problem for modernist mass housing. It's more than just a critique of mass housing and saying, well, that's housing for numbers, housing for people who are just statistical. This is about those who are outside the statistical horizon to begin with. And increasingly, as we know, the sans-papiers, etc., are constitutive of our cities. And we need, in a sense, as thinkers and practitioners of the city, to be able to think those boundaries. But
I was just wondering, listening to you, if the system has not already recycled or this idea of utopian pragmatism or realism under the guise of sustainable development.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, like hijacking and recycling the ideals of the 60s regarding utopia, the radical ones, into a way to rejuvenate a Western industry, which is completely put in jeopardy by globalization.
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. That's why I recommend the science fiction, because it's all about ecology, and you'll recognize a lot of green-like talk there. But what it's really about is about the sort of the contradiction, or let's say tensions at least, between, let's say, a green politics and a biopolitics, a politics of life. Rather than just of, because with sustainability you always have to ask what is being sustained, and it's just the same business as usual, the same green often you saw Ground Zero, they have green glass on top of the bunker, it's basically the same, which obviously is not to say that critical ecological thought is, in fact, that I think is one of the real frontiers and front lines of architectural and urban thought and practice vis-a-vis this larger set of issues. And I think, if anything, you could say that's what's changed since the post-critical days, which is now, it's like 15 years almost since all of that. It makes me feel old. But serious eco-politics has entered the mainstream of architectural thought much more than was the case then. Now, but thinking there, more. I know, not so much, but not enough. But it is more. But I was going to give you an example. One of the reasons I think that it didn't enter earlier is historical. At least this is from the American perspective. That it was Richard Nixon who set up the Environmental Protection Agency in the States. The EPA. Richard Nixon, and the theory that the strategy there was to divide the left, to basically end the 60s, because the 60s was this extended period of protest, and it built gradually a constituency, which was a kind of multivalent and heterogeneous constituency. And the Nixon people realized that you could divide that constituency. You can divide, or this was at least their strategy, the environmentalists from the civil rights people, for example, and from the feminists and from the anti-war protesters. Because what they were trying to do was to marginalize the anti-war protesters. And so that was the thinking, was that would be a sort of soft way of accepting some of the premises of protest by institutionalizing it in a relatively innocuous manner, the more radical demands of the environmental movements of the 60s. Hence, I think, and even at the time, a lot of critical intellectuals, leftist intellectuals, and so on, were very suspicious of that. There were writings. If you read even in architecture, you get this. They're very suspicious suddenly of everything to do with environment, because it sounds like Buckminster Fuller, Marshall McLuhan, and Nixon, and that's a toxic mixture.
I'm so sorry, but I
Yeah,
think
we have to stop. Okay, we can keep going. Oh, yeah, he wants to ask a question.
Okay, yes, it's something.
Yeah, I know you have drinks out there, right? Don't you want a drink?
It's something coming from a person which is trying to finish a thesis.
Just finish, please.
So, in one hand, we have modernity into an island, something like that. And in the other hand, we have postmodernity living in a cloud, something like this. No? So people who wants to continue with the modernity try to fly to Mars.
Yeah, basically,
And
yeah.
people which will need to stay here in the Earth
Yeah.
needs to take the test of François Lyotard, Jameson,
Yeah, sure.
Shafuri, and Walter Benjamin.
Of course.
So is this one of the resumes of the confrontation in between the lecture of John Ockman and Reinhold Martin for the...
Oh, are we supposed to say
aim of
I'm
the
Mars
Congress?
and you're Earth? I don't know. I hope not. I don't know, I have to ask Joan. So since I missed Joan's talk, I can't answer, I can only answer half, I guess. I don't think it's a choice. I think what I was wanting, the reason for putting these two parts, right, very stark. One, very, very hopefully recognizable and tangible, and you can understand right away the politics of architecture at ground zero. And the other one, kind of like watching a movie, a story, a science fiction movie that's very serious about its politics. The point is that we cannot make a choice. This is to simply say that either you invest in some or imagine that you answer the question what is to be done by saying go to Mars, or get back down to Earth. Going to Mars is getting back down to Earth. That's the point of this, but it's not so much about getting real. In some, like, we've had our fun, now it's time to go back to business and do boring things, and but rather recognizing exactly the line that allows you to imagine, because like all science fiction, if you read these stories, it reflects much more about the author's own world than it does about any actual possibility of some future world. It's a mirror in that sense. And including all of the realism. If you read it now, some of it is quite anachronistic. It actually is, it's been superseded by, like, they don't have the internet on Mars. They communicate in, so things like that. So anyway, for me at least, and Joan will speak for herself, but for me at least, the confrontation, as you're saying, is with the line. It's to ask what is or is not thinkable at this moment. That's what's real. What's real is the way in which the imagination is configured. And you can't get out of that. It's not escapable. It's not like suddenly you can just do anything. But what you can become aware of, the ways in which the forces organizing your world, our world, are making certain thoughts thinkable and certain thoughts unthinkable. And you can do that on the ground, literally in the ground, down, in ground zero, or you can do it in the sky. But either way, you're basically on either side of a line, and the line is what's real. So that's my response. Anyway, okay.